once to indicate that no more points of information can be offered. At the 7th minute, the timekeeper will ring the bell 2 times. At 7 minutes 15 seconds, the timekeeper will ring the bell 3 times. The adjudicators will not consider any part of the speech after 7 minutes and 15 seconds. After the opposition whip has given his or her speech, the reply speech from the opposition must be given, followed by that of the government. The reply speech should take 4 minutes. Time will be indicated at the 3rd minute by the bell. The timekeeper will ring the bell again at the 4th minute. No points of information may be offered during the reply speeches. The audience may clap their approval but may not hoot or jeer. I would now like to invite the Prime Minister to give his speech.
Maybe it's not believable that one country's harm to the environment can cause a significant harm to the rest of the world. But when more nations all come together and all continue to pollute the environment, the magnitude of the harm towards the environment and the rest of the world increases and becomes much, much higher. We need to take a step now. We can postpone development, but we can't postpone the recovery of our environment. Let's look at the one substantive that I'll be talking about. But before that, a few problems that I want to characterize with the environment. Firstly, let's look at the sinking islands, or islands that are countries that are surrounded by water. For example, the Maldives or Bangladesh or other small countries that have no option to opt out of these problems of their country sinking. All efforts in combating these countries to sink, but are failing because of the water rising too fast, and countries can't do anything about it. Secondly, the increase in global temperature in the past 40 years has been in 2 or more degrees, and this will continue if we don't take a step now into maintaining the global temperature that we currently have. Thirdly, the damage to the environment has caused a lot of species of animals to become extinct, and we are all the fault of that. And the fourth and last problem that I will characterize is that the thinning of the ozone layer, the increase in the amount of UV rays that come into our country cause things like cataract, cause things like skin cancer that would be a problem to a lot of people that can't opt out of it just because of the problem that a lot of other countries cause. This would be a horrible condition for a lot of people to live in. If we don't do something now, it's obviously going to get worse. How will our policy work in today's debate? Firstly, we think that a lot of nations are dependent on other developed countries such as the US and Germany for developmental aid. So we will give them the aid to proportionate to how much damage they cause to the environment. For example, if there is a 1% increase in the carbon emission that is released, we reduce the aid by a certain percentage, and this will be decided by that particular country. There is international consensus that things like the EIA reports or the carbon emission reports are accurate measurements as to how much a country pollutes, and we are more than happy to use these kinds of measurement. So all these things are ones that are feasibility. But why is this policy principally justified? On 5 reasons. The first reason is that developed countries have a duty to protect the rest of the world. For example, when US sanctions Iran when they come up with their nuclear program, when US sanctions Uganda for their homophobic laws against the gay people in Uganda, these are all general consensus that other countries are okay with developed countries taking over and protecting the rest of the world. So this is an extension of their protection and of their duty to the rest of the world. The second reason is that using developmental aid is very effective. How so? Firstly, these countries always make a lot of bad financial decisions. They always buy in the wrong stock market, they always buy into wrong shares, and there is generally a bad management of money in all these countries. So secondly, it's very believable that all these countries have things like a lot of corruption, a lot of bribery rates, and so on and so forth. This all means that they depend a lot on foreign help to develop their country. This also means that our policy will be effective in making sure that they will change. But how? Will they have an incentive to improve? Because corporations are the ones that take over the development in these countries. For example, Shell and Petron, for example, right? So they come into the country and they take over take the oil and natural resources, and they help to develop the country as well. And while doing that, they pollute a lot of and harm the environment on a magnitude of a scale in developing their country, and this has to be a problem that is richly stopped. But there is a reason why Shell, the amount of carbon emission released in US is lesser than the carbon emission is released in Togo or compared to Nigeria. So Shell also gets a lot of oil from Nigeria and Togo, but the carbon emission there is so much more than the carbon emission released in US because of the very relaxed and lax policies of these countries that are very relaxed about the carbon emission or any other problems when it comes to the environment. We need them to fix the policies, and we need them to care for the environment more. But before I move on, any one of you?
Developmental aid normally helps to aid society as a whole. If it's the fault of the corporations that the country is emitting too much carbon dioxide, why not punish the corporations instead of what you're doing now, which is punishing society?
See, you don't get it. Like Shell gets a lot of oil from Malaysia as well, but they also get a lot of oil from like countries like third world countries like Nigeria and Togo. But the carbon emission or the harm to the environment in those countries are worse than there are in other developed countries or other countries that they get oil from as well, because of their policies that are stricter in other developed countries and other countries that are compared to third world countries, because they are too lazy to fix their policies, or they just want to generally make more money. And we are willing to trade that off. We are willing to make sure that these third world countries get lesser money, but they also take care of the environment at the same time. The third reason as to why we need this policy and why it's principally justified is because of the time sensitivity issue. We need the actions of this. We need the actions of these countries at this point in time, because there won't be a point in the future, because we never will be able to curb this problem in the future. Secondly, it's irreversible. So the priority has to be the environment in circumstance. We can develop our country later, but we can't make sure that the environment won't be polluted later, because what has been done has been done. So you have to defend a world where all these things exist and you can't do anything about it later, even though that's going to be obviously one of the characterizations of your case. The fourth reason is that the countries have a duty to protect their own people. Have a seat, madam. And it's not selfish of a duty. So all these developed countries that give aid to other developmental aid to other third world countries, for example US, they all have a duty to protect the citizens of US. That's why the US fights ISIS, because they know that there's a possibility that they will attack US and they need to protect their national security. So the harms of the environment is turning bad and will also affect the rest of the world. So the rest of the world and the other developed countries have a duty to protect its own people, because the harm to the environment might also affect them, and it's not one of a selfish reason to protect in the first place. The fifth and last reason as to why this policy is principally justified is that people who never consented into the harms of the environment, they never consented into the pollution of a particular country, are also, and the people that are most affected by the harms of the environment. So because of a particular countries, like for example Bangladesh's foreign or domestic policies, the people of the country are all affected. So they have to reallocate their houses, they have to change, they have to move to other places and have to change their lifestyle because of certain countries' selfish policies of the environment. All these things can be mitigated once we set a policy in making sure that these countries will change their policy in favor of protecting the environment. Development can be postponed, but the harms to the environment are irreversible. We're very proud to propose.
Speakers spoke for 7 minutes and 22 seconds.
Thank you. And now I would like to call upon the leader of the opposition team to give his speech.
Testing. Mr. Speaker, we are willing to protect the environment. We're willing to take measures for nations, set a ceiling to the amount of pollution that it can cause to the environment. But we think when nations fully comply fully to environment rules, we think that hinders the economical development that is so vital for developing nations as a whole. Something that is not a fair trade-off of what developing nations are going to get at the end of the day. If you want to set a ceiling to how much pollution corporations and nations can do, how much the ceiling of pollution that corporations can do towards the environment, that's okay with us. But that protecting the environment shouldn't come at the expense of hindering the economical development in a particular nation itself. But before I move on to my characterizations, let's take a look at a few rebuttals coming from our side. Number one, how developed nations have a duty to protect the world. Look, you're not protecting developing nations as a whole. Why do we say so? It's because the vital thing for developing nations need to survive is economical growth. And how economical growth comes is when they have a market, when developing nations are allowed the access to extract natural resources that attracts investments from corporations into investing in their countries. When you want them to fully comply to environmental laws, you fully hinder the progression that's going to happen. Now, you disincentivize corporations to come in and invest because there is no market for these individuals to access natural resources. There is no market for them to extract natural resources from the nations as a whole. Number two, how developmental aid is the best thing to do so, right? Look, now you're cutting the main revenue of the nation. They do not have access towards the natural resources already. Even though they comply with international rules which hinders the economical development, even with the money in hand that you're going to get, you are unable to utilize it as a whole also, because developmental aid is meant for you to develop your country. When your country's development is contingent upon natural resources and investments coming out from other corporations, when there is no market in your country already, even with developmental aid, you are unable to develop your nation. Number three, profit-oriented corporations, right? The very idea that they are profit-oriented proves that these corporations need money, only wants money, right? Without a market for profit, there won't be investment. We're okay for you to set a ceiling of pollution, of how much pollution that they can cause. We're not okay for you to fully comply to international rules. But lastly, on irreversible harms, right? Look, you need to concede that there's already sufficient international pressure. Even though some nations opt out from international laws, we still think there's a sufficient stigma, international stigma and international pressure upon these countries to set a ceiling on how much pollution that they can cause to the environment. This is sufficient for you to protect the environment as a whole. Sit down. Let's take a look at a few characterizations coming up from side opposition. Number one, which are the countries that need this developmental aid the most, right? There are two of these. Number one, how countries that already have insufficient natural resources, how developmental aid is their only source of economical development, right? When you completely block them the access from extracting their already insufficient natural resources, even with the developmental aid that is so minute, they are unable to have economical development. They are unable to achieve being a first world nation at the end of the day. But number two, how countries that have a lot of natural resources, right? When they are unable to have access towards the natural resources, there will be no market for economical growth. Now, you jeopardize the people even more, because without the market, without the investments of corporations, people are unable to get jobs, and the state's welfare aren't going to be able to sustain the lifestyle of people that long also. You further victimize and jeopardize the people. Number two, what global policies are based upon, right? Global policies are based upon countries that can do it already. What does this mean? It means that if you're a first world nation, you have the capacity to protect the environment, then you can do so. So why do we think developing nations do not have capacity to do so? It's because the only thing forming their market for them to have economical growth, for the standards of living of the people on the nation itself to be sustained, is to have the market of extracting natural resources, which forms the main revenue of their country. When you block that, you block the economical growth happening in their country. But lastly, of the capacity of the nation, right? We think that the states of the nations itself knows their capacity, and if you hinder if the state of the nation thinks that they have the capacity to protect the environment and also having economical growth, they can do so. But we think when the states do not have the capacity to have economical growth coexisting with following international laws, we think that should be a choice that we should respect at the end of the day. Before I move on to my argument, go.
Sir, all your points assume that we completely cut off this developmental aid. Yeah. If you reduce the amount of pollution of that particular country, we will give you more aid. I don't understand why development can't coexist with taking care of the environment.
it doesn't matter, because at the end of the day, the economical market, it's contingent upon the natural resources that you get. If you want to have a stable market, you need to have a lot of access towards the natural resources. If you're only going to limit them to a small part of their natural resources, you are limiting the economical market as a whole. Even with developmental aid, you are unable to build infrastructures as a whole, because in order for you to build infrastructures, in order for you to have occupations, you also need to sacrifice the environment. I have two arguments for you today. Number one, how their policy hinders the main goal of developing nations. Number two, how it jeopardizes the standard of living of citizens. First argument, what is the main aim of developing nations? Do you think that the main aim of developing nations is to achieve development, right? These are the countries that are in need of economical growth the most. And look, this is something that you need to recognize. In order for you to achieve development, there is something that you need to sacrifice. How do we say? Why do we say so? Because in US itself, when they have so much oil, these are the certain forms of sacrifice of the environment that they form as a trade-off in order to be a first world nation in status quo. They sacrifice the environment. They sold off their oil. They extract their oil. That's why they become a first world nation in status quo. Economic growth only happens through natural resources in developing nations such as Malaysia, where the main revenue is oil. In Brazil, where the main revenue is food and etc. Right? Look, fully complying to the environmental laws hinders the development, right? In a case where they choose to fully comply, even with developmental aid, it is redundant, right? Look, you need to have a fair trade-off. We can set a ceiling to the pollution that you can make, but it shouldn't come at the expense of destabilizing the economical growth in the country. Second argument, how it jeopardizes the standard of living of the citizens. In order for you to have a local market, you need to have access towards the natural resources in your ground. In order for people on the ground to have pays and occupations, it's all contingent to the local market, and the local market is ex-bound to the maximum resource on the ground, right? How much you earn, how much the people earn, it depends on the occupations, right? And when people do not have stable occupations, and when their pay is really so little, you now limit their contributions towards the environment. An example, for you to have a hybrid car, you need to have a stable salary. When you do not have occupations, when you do not have a job, you don't have a stable salary, you cannot contribute towards the environment also. We want to protect the environment, but it should never come at the expense of hindering the economic development of developing nations. Thank you.
Speakers spoke for 7 minutes and 32 seconds.
Thank you. And now I would like to invite the Deputy Prime Minister to give his speech.
Ryan gave a very truistic speech as to why more aid to more developing nations will eventually lead to a better nation. This debate is not about that. He never gave us a justification as to why development can come at the expense of harming the environment and harming a bunch of other people who never ever consented to your selfish and disgusting policies that harm a lot of people, like people of Bangladesh, Mauritius, and increase in temperature. That was all the characterization that Nimran gave to you in today's debate. Something that was not responded to. He never really told us how he's going to solve the environment. He never told us how he will make it better. I'll be doing three things. Firstly, a few responses to them. Secondly, two arguments. Number one, why there are no other alternatives in protecting the environment. All the other alternatives have failed or have become inefficient. But secondly, why we can push for better policies when the issue of whether or not environment is a priority no longer becomes an issue and is objectively correct that the environment must be protected. Before that, the two things that he told us to Nimran's speech. Number one, that we are not protecting developing nations. We don't want to protect developing nations because of your policies that have harmed the environment. We want to protect the rest of the world who don't have the ability to defend themselves against these policies that harm the environment. But the second thing they told us was that it's bad and it harms the development of a nation. We know it's bad and it's a trade-off we're willing to make. If we are willing to say that we may harm a few people at the end of the day, then the developing nation may lose a certain amount of money. But it's a trade-off we're willing to make because of the expense of the environment, which will harm a lot of individuals in the future if we don't do anything about it. So the trade-off, therefore, is justified. But he never responded to the other layers of analysis that Nimran provided to you. He never told us why it's okay to do this when it's time-sensitive and these kinds of natural disasters are irreversible and dangerous in nature. He never responded to the fact that we have the duty to protect our own citizens, meaning Ugandan policies or policies from Togo will affect Americans and America has to protect Americans as well. But another thing they never told us was that he never told us why we will never be able to fulfill more policies and why the policies are more effective. Before I move on to a few more rebuttals,
Concede yes or no that regardless without your policy, there is some international environmental laws the countries still have to comply to.
My argument is going to be about why those laws are failing and why they're inefficient in today's debate. I'll explain that later, I promise you. Before that, let's move on to a few rebuttals that he had. He promises two things in this debate. Let's see whether he really fulfilled the things that he promised in today's debate. Number one, he told us that we should punish corporations and not punish the country at the end of the day. But number two, he told us that it's bad for the developer in nature, and he tried to justify whether that's justified. Firstly, why not punish corporations? First of all, it's hard to do that. If we could very easily punish corporations, we would. But second response is that the countries are also accountable for these problems. Meaning, the very idea that the country made lax policies and lazy policies that allow these nations to harm the environment in the first place is a reason to believe that they are also liable and guilty in they are complicit in this crime of the environment. Meaning, they also get a benefit. If Shell uses cheap technology and gains more oil with lesser cost, the country gains revenue at the end of the day. The country gets to tax Shell, there is more oil in their own nation. Meaning that nation has an incentive to ensure that companies like Shell have the ability to pollute at the same time because they get an incentive. So they are also liable and we have to punish them. But the last thing, he told us that, or he assumed that all countries are very stringent. And he told us that all countries follow every regulation to the environment. Really? Is this really true in this world? If that, by that logic, we should not have this debate because the environment will be spick and span. But that's not the case in today's debate. And I'll tell you that later. But the second thing they told us was that it's bad for development. He never told us why the eventual development of that nation will eventually help the environment in the future. He just told us development is good, but never really answered the question whether or not a developed nation like on their side in the future will be able to actually solve the environmental problems. But secondly, the next concern was that they don't have a capacity. We have already given reasons to you as to why they do. If we already given you a basic amount of aid, if you increase the carbon emissions, we reduce the percentage of aid that you have. Meaning you have a basic capacity to reduce or increase the carbon emissions that you put forward in the environment. If you choose that profit is more important, then we will not help you because we don't want to be complicit in you harming the environment at the end of the day. But the third response that we have was they told us that global policies are only catered to first world nations. There's a reason why it's called the global policy, guys. It caters to the world where everyone has come to a consensus to what is reasonable to accept when a nation can actually pollute the environment, how much can they pollute. But last thing, nimbleness beyond is very important. He told us that we are very reasonable. If we give you aid, that means at a point in time you have the capacity to do so. If you have aid, you maybe cap how much carbon emissions that a corporation can make in those countries. But if you choose to omit from those kinds of responsibilities that you have to the world, you have decided to opt out of our system. Meaning we don't have a justification to help you when you are hurting a bunch of other people at the end of the day. No thank you. My argument, why the other alternatives have failed. There are four alternatives that are made in this debate. Firstly, international condemnation. Secondly, sanctions towards this nation. Thirdly, treaties like the Kyoto Protocol. And lastly, the very idea that there's little to no political traction to improve the environment. Firstly, international condemnation. Nobody really cares if I say I condemn this nation because they are polluting too much. The country will not care because they have an incentive to make more profit. So the proofs. Do I want to be condemned versus the amount of billions of dollars that I can get from that oil company giving me money? I'm more likely to choose the profit because international condemnation is now proven to be ineffective. Secondly, sanctions. Sanction only works when you have foreign trade with a nation. Most of this debate occurs in nations where they want developmental aid only and not compared to foreign trade or foreign investments from other nations. Meaning if you hit them by its heart at the developmental aid at the point in time where they need the developmental aid to improve their nation, that is the most effective way in order to curb this policy at the end of the day. Lastly, there's another way. Treaties like the Kyoto Protocol, agreements that have been signed. The most, most prestigious protocol in status quo is probably the Kyoto Protocol, right? And China has been a part of the Kyoto Protocol. China has polluted more than the world has polluted in the past 100 years, Mr. Speaker. These are examples to prove to you that people don't even care about treaties to begin with, but more often than not, any other way. But the last thing is political traction. Because there is little to no political traction for people on the ground in these developing nations to actually improve the society. If politicians simply say, if you let me take oil out of this nation and I may pollute some people, I can make prices of food cheaper. People make that a priority compared to the environment. Meaning there is little to no political traction for politicians on the ground to make actual better policies to improve the environment in status quo. Meaning that side will never be able to improve the environment and the idea. The last piece of analysis I provide back to you. under our debate, where we have established that the environment is an objective priority that must all cater to, it no longer becomes a debate of whether or not the environment is a priority. Things like 49 senators voting against basic climate change, which is a fact that we cannot deny, already proves to you that some ambiguity is whether or not the environment is a priority. But we want to make it sure that the environment is always the priority. So the debate then becomes not the environment is the priority or not, the debate becomes which policy better caters to the environment, which we've already established is a priority to the world. Meaning at the end of the day, we better protect the environment. But the justification that we've already provided you from Nimalan's speech as well as my speech is that we can always push forward for development later. We may harm certain groups of individuals and we're willing to live with that. But at a point in time where you can't environment with irreversible, time-sensitive damages that we cannot reduce in the future, we will not stand by those atrocities committed by side opposition.
Speakers spoke for 7 minutes and 15 seconds.
Thank you. And now I would like to call upon the deputy leader of the opposition team to give his speech.
Test. Okay. Ladies and gentlemen, both sides need to agree on one thing, right? That the environment is important and that the economy is important. They accuse us of being truistic by saying that development is important, but they themselves were truistic by saying that the environment is important. This debate evolves into which side can balance both of it more. And we think that in a circumstance where you're an undeveloped country or developing country, the capacity of you to follow and comprehend with environmental laws is extremely hard to do. So therefore, today I'm going to prove to you in my substantive why it's better if they let them develop into becoming a developed country, therefore they can comply, society themselves will follow environmental laws as a whole. But before that, a few points of rebuttals, right? Because let's hear what they characterize the environment to be. They say that people never consented into any like ozone layers being thin or anything like that. We agree. But also, under our side, no, the people in the third world countries or the people in the developing countries never consented into being victimized because they are not developed, right? They themselves are going to suffer and bear the most hurt because they themselves are the ones who won't get the jobs that they want. They won't get the right security that they want. They won't get the welfare they want. So under both sides, it's true. People never consented to these harms. Secondly, they say that it's irreversible. We think that under their side, the environmental harm is irreversible, but under our side, developmental is also development being hindered is irreversible and time sensitive too. The people who suffer will never probably get the training that they get. So in the end, it's very time sensitive for these people too. The people in these underdeveloped countries or developing countries will never get right job opportunities. So for that long period when you're trying to save the environment, which is going to take forever, right? All these people will always be victimized. All these people for generations to come will always suffer. So therefore, I'm going to prove to you why under our side, we can also help better the environment later. But before that, a few points of substantives, right? They say that that is mostly the corporations. They say it's the moral responsibility for developed countries to handle developing countries. But here's where we question that logic, right? Because their proportionality to how much you give them developmental aid is up to Germany or the US themselves. What's not stopping the US and Germany from making these underdeveloped countries and these third world countries or whatever from stopping their carbon emissions so that they can do it more? We think that in the end, you give the playing card towards the US and Germany to decide how much they can pollute the environment as a whole. So that means that if the US and Germany wants to do it themselves, they just put harder conditions on them themselves. Because we can't be fooled by we can't be fooled by them, right? Not all developed countries are actually so good that they want to protect the environment. Most of them, such as China, pollute the environment even more. We think it's unfair to let the conditions be put on these developed countries because in the end, you're exploiting underdeveloped or developing countries you're exploiting the developing countries for the state they're in because in the end, they can't develop. But in the end, if we want to help our economy, we will just put harsher standards towards them. Secondly, they said that corporations is mostly the fault of the corporations. Yes, it's true. It's mostly the fault of the corporations. That's why we think your side loses. Because it's the fact that the corporations themselves are the people who pollute the environment. It's these corporations that let carbon emissions happen. Now what you're doing right now, the most people who are affected isn't really the government, isn't the corporations, it's society themselves. If you have a problem with corporations putting it out, then deal with the corporations as a whole. Lastly, they say that it's not proportionate. That since you can do it proportionately, so now these developing countries can adapt to it. We don't think so, right? Because either you comply with it a lot, therefore you get a lot of developmental aid, but what are you going to use the developmental aid for when you have nothing to build because when you can't use your factories or when you can't use anything at all? So in the end, you get a lot of money for developmental aid, but you can't use it because it goes against international law. Or in the other hand, if you don't comply, so you want to develop, you don't get the developmental aid whatsoever. So don't be fooled by the motion. All because it says it's proportionate doesn't mean anything whatsoever. Because it's proportionate, you either get a lot of money without the capacity to use it, or you get a lot of room for development, but you have no money to use it whatsoever. Before I move on to my suspension.
So, the same society that you want to protect now and you want to get richer is the one that will be living in a hotter surrounding in the future with all the money that they have. Are you willing to trade that?
What?
So, the society that you want to protect now is the one that will get richer but will live in a hotter and a worse off environment in the future. Are you willing to trade that off with all the money?
The people that we are protecting now will always live in a the people that we are protecting under your side will always fail in development. They have no development whatsoever. They have no proper wages. They have no proper education whatsoever. Your side is trying to say that if these under these developing nations will never follow, right? And we will improve. Okay, we think that they will not suffer as much, right? Because there's always international pressure which goes against Russians' substantives, right? We think international pressure, sanctions and all these things do work on people. They say that it's only because they are developing, that's why it doesn't work. But Mr. Speaker, for a long sustainable country to have trade and whatsoever, we think they will comply, right? Because not all developing countries are only one-sided thinking that, okay, we get this instant gratification of denying this, getting developmental aid, and then therefore we won't be scared of sanctions. Once these developing countries become developed, obviously they wouldn't want to be sanctioned by other people, because then what's the point of being developed? You don't get trade, you can't provide for the people. So in the end, we think that these international pressures and things like this, they do work. So we think that they will comply with international laws, but we don't think that they should be jeopardized by the loss of developmental aid as well. We think that they won't pollute it that much as a whole, because for the longevity of the state itself. Alright, first, now this is how we're going to prove to you how the environment will be better under our side. First level, right? The point is how undeveloped countries pollute more than the developed countries in the long run. Let's look at the first level. Let's make a comparison of society themselves, the people on the ground. In underdeveloped countries, you need to realize that money-wise, they're not that rich. They're not that rich. And money and time-wise, right? Most of their jobs are from 10 to 10 or 9 to 5. They don't have much time to care about anything, right? Because the first thing on their mind is, I need to get food for my child. I need to put food on my table. I don't need to care about the environment. So this is where we draw to you the example, right? And this is where we link it to today's debate. First of all, you need to realize that for examples like normal laymen like you and me, if we are extremely poor, we wouldn't be able to afford buying reusable Tupperwares or whatever. Instead, we'll use polystyrene Tupperwares, which pollute the environment. But on a larger scale, right, or for more local foreign workers, for more local workers who owns a factory or something, they wouldn't have enough money or enough care to put filter funnels in their chimneys, right? In the end, we think that once you're in an undeveloped country, the environment isn't the #1 priority in your mind. Second level, right? Why is this so impactful? Because now society themselves don't actually want to comply with environmental laws. They themselves, the first thing on their mind isn't that I don't care about the environment right now. I care about myself. I care about being able to buy food for my family. I care about getting clothes and all. So under our side, once from that undeveloped state, once they become developed, then it's more easy for them to have time for the environment, right? It's easier for them to comply with environmental laws because they have more capacity to do so. We are very proud to oppose.
Speaker spoke for 7 minutes and 22 seconds.
Thank you. And now I would like to invite the government whip to give his speech.
When global warming threatens to destroy the world, when Bangladesh is being threatened of sinking, and when the greenhouse effect has threatened many people, and the haze the haze has threatened the health of the people, right? We think that side opposition, these are very real threats that we face, that side opposition chooses to ignore, and we think that it's shameful for them to do so, right? 3 issues in today's debate. Firstly, is Rich House better champions the development of nations. Second, deterrence. And thirdly, social impact. Firstly, Rich House better champions the development of nations. They want development at the expense of the environment, where the environment is already at its most and it's already going to die. They still want it because of the development of the nations. We on our side told you that the development can also happen while protecting the environment, where we have assessments, EIA, where we assess the countries. We think that every time you, for example, every time you reduce your carbon emission by 1%, we give you certain more developmental aid. These are kinds of incentives that side government protects. We also protect the environment. We also care about development. Under your side, you want development at the expense of the environment. We think that is shameful for you to do so. Hold on. And for example, it's using cheap alternative resources such as green building, right? Using materials that don't harm the environment. These are kinds of things that you can easily use, and the countries can easily change. But under your side, you want more money, you want more profit, you're more profit oriented. We think that is shameful, and we think that is something you must understand. And another example such as biofuel, right? Where you use plants as your fuel. We think that these are kinds of things that you're easily obtained. Every country has at least some form of dead leaves for you to use as biofuels, right? We think that that's extremely important to recognize, because you can easily use it. Why under your side, why is it important? Why aren't you still using it, right? And before I move, hold on, let me finish this issue. And therefore, we think that development can also exist under your side, but even if somehow, right, we do hinder development, we think that it's important to recognize that we must prioritize the environment, because without the environment, there won't be any ecosystem, there won't be any fields for you to plant, there won't be any food for you to distribute. Under your side, you want to protect that, but under our side, when the fields are all dried up, how are you to provide food in the first place for the poorer families? We think that that's extremely important to recognize. And before I move on to your idea of deterrence, yes.
Alright, all these dead leaves and all this reusable energy, that's helping my point, because these things are not easy to access for poor countries. If it really is the access for these things, any country would use it. We're talking about the expensive stuff that normally is not easy to access for undeveloped countries.
So, we think that the government should provide basic kinds of things such as recycling. We don't think that the poor people can't recycle. And if your problem is about people not having enough food, then when the environment is all dried up, when there's drought and there's all these kinds of things happening, then there won't be any food to be able to plant in the first place. When the soils are all salted, we think that under your side, no food will be there for the poor people in the first place. You don't even give them that option, right? And on the second issue on deterrence, they talked about a big idea on how international pressure will work. But then the second speaker comes and say that China still pollutes. Why is that happening? That proves that because so many countries already condemn China for polluting, we think that there's a contradiction coming from their side, because if China still continues to pollute, then we have to concede that international pressure is not working in current status quo. It's extremely important to recognize that developing aid will create a better incentive for them to improve, right? Because China is more prioritized industrialization and more profit oriented. We think that these are kinds of countries that do not care about the world, and especially when it's a transnational issue, where for example, if Malaysia pollutes, Singapore will suffer. If the Indonesia burns trees and causes haze, Malaysia will suffer. These are kinds of ripple down effect that under your side you choose to ignore. You want developing nations more. We on our side, we do not want to get lung cancer. We do not want to wear masks to school every day. It's really, really annoying. Under your side, you want that to happen. We think that that's not fashionable.
If your biggest issue is protecting the environment, then it's not exclusive under your side also. We have proven to you, as long as you have the money, you have the capacity to protect the environment also. That only happens when you have the local market to provide you with occupations and salary.
Sir, if your main problem is job opportunities, we don't think you can. It comes at the expense of cutting down entire forests. We think that when you especially do that, then the resources will eventually run out. When there isn't any forest to cut down anymore, when there isn't any oil to dig out from, we think that under your side is extremely detrimental. Under our side, we provide innovation. When we make countries innovate on their green technology, right? Green technologies such as biofuel, such as all these kinds of examples we've already given, right? Such as hydroelectric. Hydroelectric is already present in countries. We think that that's extremely important to recognize, and that side opposition has failed to do so, right? And moving on to my last issue is social impact. Their whole problem is that people don't have enough food. People on the ground will be harmed. But here's the thing, that people, when the environmental is harmed, people in the whole world will be harmed. We think that the development of the nation can be hindered because we want to save the environment first. Because without the environment, there is no earth. There is nothing for you to develop. As the first speaker already told you, it's a time sensitivity issue. In 50 years' time, there won't be any more Singapore. We think that's extremely important to we think that even when it comes down to that, we think that we should prioritize our environmental just a little bit. So under that, we think that societal impact is extremely important. Even though societal impact is extremely important, we don't think it should come under the expense of allowing you to desecrate entire forests, to deforest it, to constantly pollute all these kinds of ice. We think that these are kinds of things that is extremely important, right? So what has SIDE government told you about today? We told you there is time sensitivity, where there are countries that is sinking, and when they're in time, nations will disappear, and something they decided to ignore, and also how it's an irreversible effect, because you can't unmelt the ice, you can't stop the global warming. We think that this is something they also choose to ignore because they prioritize the development. They want another sky tower or whatever. We think that that's extremely harmful under your side. Opposition is fine with the destruction of the world and public health, because under our side, in order for us to preserve and what's left of our side with side of government.
Speaker spoke for 7 minutes and 15 seconds.
Thank you. And now I would like to invite the opposition whip to give her speech. Hello.
If I live in a country where I already have insufficient amount of resources, where every day when I go home I don't have enough food, when my family is starving as a whole, is it then for me to prioritize the idea of my survival rather than the environment? We think so. The problem within their policy is that they always aim for the idea that, they have the capacity to do so, and in the long term run, they will always survive. That's not how within their policy. Take a step further. Analyze it within a situation where the idea of them not having the capacity is the main reason why they don't do so. Every country wants to be environmental friendly. Every country realizes the importance to do so. The reason why they're not doing so right now is they realize that there are other forms of trade-offs that they are not being able to, they cannot take and cannot make that trade-off within society right now. It's not that they do not want to, it's that they cannot make that choice within society right now, because that choice and that trade-off that needs to be taken within their policy has that harm that is made towards their country. Two issues for you today, right? Firstly, should developmental aid always be contingent upon the idea of compliance with global policies? But secondly, let's take a step back and analyze the idea of it being a long-term and short-term harm, and analyzing the situation within both sides and comparing paradigms. First issue, right? Let's analyze within status quo, should it ever be contingent? 4 reasons for you specifically. Firstly, let's analyze developmental aid. When do we ever take away developmental aid from your country? When do we ever make it contingent upon a specific avenue? We think within status quo right now, developmental aid is that idea of which every country realizes that this is something that is a necessity in your country. That's the main reason why we're giving to you. Even if we want to take it away and we want you to achieve something before you can get developmental aid, we realize that without developmental aid, you cannot achieve the next level or getting to the level as a whole. Even though it's within that policy, you hinder the idea of progress or the idea of ever getting to the next stage on that platform as a whole. You further harm their policy. But even if you say that, you now incentivize the idea of them to because now developmental aid is a necessity, that's when you further harm them. Because even if it incentivizes them, you never change the mindset within society. Let's talk about the mindset. The mindset within society is the only reason they are following your policies because they need developmental aid. As soon as they don't need your developmental aid, the mindset is not changed. They will not follow your policy. The idea is that your policy becomes redundant. You do not have that idea of which when they are already a developed country and they have the capacity to take care of the environment, they will not do so because under your policy, you deprive them and you painted it to a picture to them where it is so big that we can take away your developmental aid. There's a high chance of them not following your policy in the near future. That harms your policy even more. Take a chance, look at the long-term harm that exists within your policy as a whole. Secondly, sit down. Secondly, we have to think and analyze the mindset within society. Had you not changed the mindset of individuals, their long-term idea when they already have the capacity and they don't need your developmental aid and they do not need your aid at all, that's when you already have control within your own nation. You do not change the mindset. Environment gets further harm within your policy and it's even worse within your policy. Where international pressure doesn't work because they realize no importance of protecting the environment. Thirdly, right, we have to realize how there's natural form of check and balance within society. And here's the distinctive difference. In terms of when they still need your developmental aid, here's the check and balance that exists within our policy. International pressure is very important, something they never tackle. International pressure exists within all countries as a whole because we realize if you harm the environment to the fullest extent, and they painted you the picture, the worst case scenario where let's say you do one action, the whole island sinks within say the scope. That is not the case. But had that been the case, international pressure would be very strong with you. Your international, your interaction with the other countries and your ties within other countries will get harmed, it further harms your country. There is a natural check and balance within society for you to naturally comply to certain international environmental laws because you realize that have I not complied to those international laws, people would generally put pressure on me, people would naturally discriminate me as a whole. We give you an example of BP oil spill. The amount of discrimination they received and the amount of backlash which they received was immense and they naturally regretted it as a whole. They've naturally would never ever take the chance of doing so. International pressure is very strong. But the difference within your policy is that international pressure can affect them now. In the near future, when they don't care about what your policy does, international pressure won't necessarily be accountable for them because they have other ways of doing so. Go.
If international pressure does work, and we take your best case scenario, right, then under your side, isn't the market and food more likely to be hindered because you're providing more sanctions?
Look, not really, because within society right now, we realize within society that the developmental aid you provide within those type of countries will help them protect the environment in the near future. Without developmental aid in the future, they cannot protect the environment. Within society right now, at least when they have their developmental aid, they can protect the society in the near future, and they have their own capacity to do so. But secondly, right, let's analyze the fault within that case. We also have to realize the main reason why we don't make environmental laws, environmental corporations, or environmental associations compulsory to all countries because we realize there is some form of capacity that you need to opt in and you can opt out because you realize that only you know the capacity of which you can necessarily opt into a particular system. Countries that opt into particular systems like this have already proven capacity and already have proven the idea that they can protect the environment on their own will and they don't depend on other countries as a whole. Them opting in is them choosing to protect the environment. That's them choosing to change their mindset and say the environment is very important. I choose to opt in. But fourthly, right, we realize the idea that what they promoted to you today was the government should always provide the idea of which they can do so. Assuming they cannot do so, do we then still make a trade-off with the society? Do we then still sacrifice the idea of them being developing or the basic necessities which they need within our policy for environmental laws? We don't think so. Therefore, a trade-off is very detrimental because you also have to realize the accountability that is being made within the country is the accountability by the country itself. You do not take accountability for the long-term harms that this country go through for sacrificing the idea of that period of time which they sacrifice their development period as a whole, right? Within the idea of accountability is very important in terms of how they want to naturally manage their own country because anything that happens in long-term harm, they have to take accountability for. If they choose to opt out, respect those particular decisions. Sit down. But my conclusion, my first issue is that we realize in cases like this, we don't make it contingent upon developmental aid, we don't make developmental aid contingent upon any other factors because we realize that for capacity is very important. The long-term harm that they face is always accountable within their own scenarios. Second issue, right? Let's analyze both paradigms. Firstly, we have to realize that how we achieve their aims better. Look, they don't want to talk about how we want to protect environment and how we want to go green, right? We have to realize how we achieve this better. Sure, we can see in that short-term harm, we do make some form of short-term harms within our policy, and we do make some form of things that might not be reversible or might be reversible. Within our policy, at least in long-term harm, when countries do opt in particular system, at least they follow based on their own will, at least they want to protect their environment based on their own will. Within the long-term harm, our policy is much more effective in terms of having to change mindset, in terms of wanting to protect country environments as a whole. At least within our policy, in terms of what we give them the form of time to develop as a whole, there's a high chance of wanting to opt into environmental policies because they have the capacity to do so. Secondly, right, we think within our policy, the harm within our policy exists on several levels. Then firstly, we also have to realize that it cannot be a blanket policy within status quo. Something that Ryan already talked to you about. The blanket policy that you wanted to promote is that, oh, no, it's not a blanket policy. We still give them some form of developmental aid, but it's also insufficient for them to grow. Sure, you give them that form of small development aid that within your policy looks sufficient, but it's not sufficient for them to grow as a whole. The harm we propose within your policy is further irreversible for countries that have to go through this long time period and cannot progress. The harm proposed on citizens, the harm proposed on the government, the harm proposed on the country as a whole is very detrimental. It's even worse under your proposal when you further harm these countries and you further promote them and you force them into a system which only gives them one form of choice. That choice is gone. You harm these countries as a whole. The harm exists within our policy.
Speakers vote for 7 minutes and 33 seconds.
And now let's hear the reply speech from the opposition team.
A development of a country is extremely important. The environment is also extremely important. This debate boils down to who can best help both. I'm going to prove to you in my reply speech and basically summarize the debate and prove how the environment can be better taken care of in the long term under our side and how development will never happen under their side. So 2 issues in today's debate. Number 1, is it fair to cut off to put this priority, to do this policy, and number 2, who best protects the environment. Firstly, they said that they can still develop, right? So this is an issue about development. Under our side, we can develop because you still get the developmental aid, you still will comply with international law because you're not going to cut off, you're not going to make yourself infertile so you can't plant anything, right? That's quite extreme under their side. I don't think a country would be that dumb to do that. But hold on, is it fair for them to halt development? They say that they can still develop, but we don't think that's true because the proportionality of their policy thing doesn't really work. Because if you get the developmental aid, that means you're not doing anything to the environment. That means you can't develop whatsoever. Or if you don't comply with it, right? Then in the end you have the capacity to use that developmental aid, but in the end you're never ever going to use it because you need to comply with the international law. So we think that in the end our side takes this issue because our side is the only one who helps out the people in these developing countries to actually get normal rights, to access the normal rights of security, to get normal proper jobs as a whole, and in the end get a better life. But in the end, let's see who best protects the environment. This is what they said, and most of their points were contingent on this. They were saying why the environment is important and why it's time sensitive. Here's the thing, right? We agree, but we don't see how your side fixes it, right? The only thing that your side does is just stop the developing countries from not polluting the environment. But in the end, it's not only the developing countries who are doing it. Many developed countries will also not comply with international law. So we think that if you want to fix something, you're fixing the wrong people. You're victimizing and you're making the society of these underdeveloped countries even more victimized as a whole. So here's what we think, right? We think that since this is such an unfair victimization, because it's not the society themselves who actually emitted this carbon gas as a whole. We think how do we best do it? How do we make society and everyone comply to international law is if you actually become developed and you take a stance against it. So this was my substantive that they didn't really care to take down, right? We told you that in most underdeveloped countries or developing countries, people don't have the incentives to care about the environment whatsoever because the first thing on their mind is the instant gratification that we can get to get my food, and in the end, I don't want to spend so much money on a hybrid car because in the end, my cheap car that emits a lot of gas and carbon monoxide is a lot better. We think that in this circumstance, we think it's a lot better under our side. When you become developed, that's when in all the benefits that they say can happen. That's when you can innovate and get biotech technology. That's when you actually opt into taking green technology instead of that cheap car that emits a lot of gas. We think that in the end, for you to have the long-term sustainability of the environment, you need to go with our side because our side are the ones that makes everyone neutralized. However, if you follow under their side, in the end, the underdeveloped countries will never be developed whatsoever. In the end, you're not fixing the problem, you're just prolonging the problem, and you're just prolonging the problem. Because Because most of their scientists assume that they can fix the environment if you stop it. Okay, first of all, that's an assumption that you can. But if you buy it, it will take a huge long time. We think it's unfair to victimize these people all because they are born in an undeveloped place. You victimize them for such a long period of time, and in the end, it's not really their fault as a whole. We think that if you want to fix the environment, you shouldn't victimize these people who necessarily didn't do it. If you want people to comply with international laws, you need to help them become developed as a whole. Because once you become developed, that's when you have the capacity to care, you have the capacity to actually comply with international laws, and capacity to comply with international laws, Mr. Speaker. We think in the balance, when it comes to development and the environment, you have to choose one. It is not a matter of whether you choose one under our paradigm. We think that under our paradigm, we can help sustain both in the long run. We take today's debate.
Speaker for 4 minutes and 3 seconds.
Thank you. And now let's hear the reply speech from the government team.
A lot of countries have hurt the environment in the past to get to where they are, and that's very regrettable. We want the side to change the mindset and the ideology that you need to harm the environment in order to develop a country. It's very possible for a country to develop, and that's not that we want to change the idea of being selfish to the environment in order for you to develop. And all of us here are facing the consequences of those countries that did that in the past. Before moving on into a comparison as to which side protects what better, let's look at a few unreasonable expectations that they put onto us. First thing that they told us was that if these countries really give them more money, they will use this money in order to protect the environment better. In that logic, obviously the country will gradually protect the environment more because we're giving them developmental aid now. Second thing that they were put onto us was that people will be forced to do a lot of things. We will force a lot of poor people to use reusable Tupperwares or more expensive things in order to protect the environment. As my whip already pointed out, as to the country changing its basic policies on the environment, like having a cap on the carbon emission, like things like this that doesn't harm the people on the ground, but are just because of foreign and domestic policies that a country can change, and it's very easy for them to change, and they will change in order for them to get the developmental aid. We have also told you that if you don't want to change, it's perfectly fine with us, but we don't have the liability to give you more aid and to be as part of the nonsense that you want to propagate to the environment. Let's look at the contradictions that they made on their side. Firstly, they wanted to tell us that, international pressure will work. Every country will obviously not harm the environment because some country tells you that what you're doing is bad, status quo is fine. But then they also told us that in order to become a developed country, we have to harm the environment. And if we don't harm the environment, our economy won't get better. So which side do they want? Like, do they want international pressure, or do they want to harm the environment continuously? A positive and a negative is still a negative. It doesn't change anything. Let's look at their world. What do they propagate in today's debate? Firstly, we're continuously going to give them developmental aid. The countries will develop. It's going to take a long time. In that period of that long time, the environment will continuously get harmed. The icebergs will continuously melt. Malaysia will get hotter and hotter, and they can't do anything about it. We just wait and wait till all of it is destroyed, and you still want to protect the economy of a particular country and harm the rest of the world. We never made it an unreasonable debate. We never said you must stop all your pollution in order for you to get the developmental aid. We said if you reduce the amount of pollution, we give you more aid. If you don't reduce the amount of pollution, we just stop giving you more aid. That's not an unreasonable policy, and it's not going to be that hard for countries to change at the end of the day. Let's look at our world. What do we propagate in today's debate? Firstly, we told you we will give them, and we will change the amount of aid we give them as to how much they pollute. If they pollute less, more trade, that's about it. So we teach countries to develop while taking care of the environment. And it's not fair for us to say that, because obviously there is a lot of ways and more and more technology now for them to do that. So we make sure that both of it coexist. We make sure that the countries also develop, and we suspend some development, but not all of it, in order to protect the environment and not create a precedence like other countries wanted to do. We proved to you why the trade-off is justified. We told you that it's easier for us to protect the rest of the world when a particular country changes its basic policies, other than comparing to the the whole world suffering because of some selfish country that doesn't want to change their policies, and we told you why it will be effective for them to change their policies in order for them to get the developmental aid, and why they are so dependent on this developmental aid that they will change their policy in favor of the environment. We are the side that gives the better environment, the best, and we also give the people the chance to live in our world for a longer time. We're very proud to propose.
People spoke for 4 minutes and 10 seconds.
So that concludes the debate. The debaters may cross the floor and shake hands, and then please take your seats with the other finalists. Over to you now, Dana and Seamus.
The adjudicators will now leave to deliberate. Ladies and gentlemen, as a highlight of our 10th year running the Swinburne Sarawak Inter-School Debating Championship, the Wildlife Conservation Society has sponsored locks for the debaters, adjudicators and the organisers of the tournament. The locks for debate and conservation signify the commitment of the debaters, adjudicators and organisers of the 10th Swinburne Sarawak Inter-School Debating Championship.
Locks are symbolic as they are used to secure precious belongings and as such are well suited to be used as pledges for one's love and commitment for important causes such as the debate and the environment.